In September 1919, two Arctic explorers, Peter Tessem and Paul Knutsen, embarked to deliver mail and scientific documents 1,000 miles away. A grand and heroic journey that would prove to be their last. This is the last journey of Tessem and Knutsen. Polar explorer Roald Amundsen and his new ship, the Maud, started an expedition to drift across the Arctic Ocean for scientific research. However, on 13 September 1918, the Maud became iced in northern Siberia, and was therefore forced to winter off Chelyuskin. Amundsen wanted the mail and documents of his expedition to reach civilization as soon as possible. He planned a 1,000-kilometer sledge journey to the weather station in Dixon. Able-bodied seaman Peter Tessem and ship carpenter Paul Knutsen were chosen for the job. Peter Tessem had suffered chronic headaches throughout the winter on the Maud, and requested to leave. Paul Knutsen was chosen to go with Tessem because he knew the location of several supply caches along the way that were left by Otto Sverdrup of the Eclipse, an expedition Knutsen had been on, the largest cache being at Meesfjorda, the halfway mark through the trek. The two men were to replenish their supplies with these caches and were instructed to leave a note at Meesfjorda. They brought with them a sledge, a tent, rifles, navigational instruments, watches, 5 sledge dogs, and provisions for 20 days. A farewell dinner was held on the Maud in their honor, and on 12 September 1919, Tessem and Knutsen took the first steps of their final tragic journey. They were never heard from again. In 1920, Amundsen sent a telegram to his brother inquiring about the safety of Tessem and Knutsen. When the message first arrived, it was brushed aside because of the political situation in Siberia at the time. However, as time passed, it became apparent that a disaster occurred, and the Norwegian government started a rescue effort. The rescue team aboard the ship Hyman left Tromsø on the 23rd of August, 1920. The ship arrived at Dixon, found nothing, and continued on to Meesfjorda. Around the Mikkjelova Peninsula, they ran into heavy ice and were forced to turn back. After another search of the surrounding area, the Hyman wintered at the weather station in Dixon. The Norwegians did not give up and put the wheels in motion to conduct an overland search expedition. Unfortunately, hiring sled dogs and reindeer for the trip was virtually impossible in remote Siberia, so they called the Soviets to assist. In January 1921, the leader of the weather station in Dixon, Timofeyevsky, sent a telegram to renowned Arctic explorer Nikifor Begichev. It's safe to say that there are few men more qualified than Begichev to assist in the search. He was familiar with the area, having been on a similar search expedition in 1915, and he had a great reputation with the locals. The plan was for Begichev to purchase reindeer and sledges, then travel up to Dixon, where he will rendezvous with the Hyman's captain Lars Jakobsen and an interpreter Alfred Carlsen. Subsequently, they would sledge to Meesfjorda, and further searching would be based on what note they find there. After receiving the telegram, Begichev left for Avam to assemble the reindeer, sledges, and drivers. Multiple lengthy negotiations later, he and a caravan of 300 reindeer and 6 drivers got underway. They arrived at Dixon on 4 June 1921, and 4 days later, on 8 June, Begichev, Jakobsen, and Carlsen started east for Meesfjorda. On 27 July, they arrived at Meesfjorda. They found the tall cairn built by Sverdrup in 1915 and boxes strewn all around the supply depot. By the cairn in a tin can was a letter from Tessem and Knutsen. 2 men of the Maud expedition traveling with dogs and sledge arrived here the 10th of November 1919. We found the cache of provisions deposited at this point in much damaged condition, especially all the bread being moldy and spoiled by seawater, showing that heavy seas have been washing over this point. We have moved the cache further in on the land, about 25 yards, and completed our stock of provisions for 20 days from the store here. We are in good condition and going to leave for Port Dixon today, November 15th, 1919, Peter L. Tessem, Paul Knutsen. They stated that they were in good condition, so some disaster occurred after they had arrived at Misfjorda. They also took only 20 days worth of food, which was barely enough for the next 500 miles. If there were any delays like a blizzard, their food would not be sufficient. On 30 July, the search group started west, retracing Tessem and Knutsen's steps as closely as possible. Nothing significant was found until 3 August, when they found an abandoned sledge. However, it was made by an inexperienced craftsman, meaning it likely didn't belong to Tessem and Knutsen, who would have made a much better sledge. On 10 August, Begichev found traces of a campfire at Misprimetny. He described the scene. On a spit, I spotted some charred firewood and walked over to it. There lay the burned bones of a man and many buttons, buckles, nails, and something else. A cardboard shotgun shell and several rifle shells. I gathered them together and started back to the tent with them. The shells turned out to be of Norwegian military pattern, dated 1915. Then I realized that one of Amundsen's companions had died here. They concluded that these were the bones of the men that they were searching for. Their theory was that during their journey in blizzard conditions, Tessem and Knutsen lost their way and ended up on this cape. Then, one of them died, and not being able to bury him, was cremated by his comrade, so that animals would not dismember the corpse. Begichev erected a post with his initials and the date, then resumed the search west in hopes of finding the other missing Norwegian. Unfortunately, on 28 August, they reluctantly abandoned their search due to worsening conditions. On 12 October 1921, the party arrived in Didinka, and Begichev and the Norwegians parted ways. With that, the impressive Soviet-Norwegian search for the 2 missing men was over. Begichev was confident that either Tessem or Knutsen had died at Misprimetny. However, further examinations of the evidence suggest that the bones are not of the 2 men, or even human. Begichev's description of the site included some unusual items that did not fall under the narrative of Tessem and Knutsen. For example, the rifle shells were dated 1912 instead of 1915. There were French buttons and French coins, and a head of a boat hook, something Tessem and Knutsen would not need for an overland expedition, was found at the site. Historians have speculated that the fire was actually evidence of the Rusnov expedition, another Arctic mystery. In 1912, a Russian government expedition led by Vladimir Rusnov was investigating coal resources in the Arctic, on the Norwegian ship Hercules. After completing his mission, Rusnov decided instead of returning home, that Hercules would travel the Northern Sea route to the Pacific. That was the last time anyone heard from Rusnov and the Hercules. Years later, multiple remnants of the Hercules were found in the general area, including Misprimetny. The fire made very little sense in context to Tessem and Knutsen, but was absolutely plausible in the context of the Rusnov expedition. The rifle shells at Primetny were identical to those of Rusnov, and both were marked with 1912. Also, Rusnov had a French wife who was on board the Hercules when it disappeared, which would explain the French buttons and coins. In Russia, it is now officially accepted that it is the Rusnov expedition that was found at Misprimetny, and a monument was established at the location. Furthermore, whether the bones were human was still unclear. In 1973, an expedition led by Dmitry Shparo located the campfire and dug up the remains that Begichev had found 40 years earlier. After analysis in Moscow, they were revealed to be reindeer bones. In 1922, geologist Nikolai Irvintsev was investigating the navigability of the Piasina and surrounding area. Participating in this excursion was none other than Nikifor Begichev. On 9 August 1922, Irvintsev spotted some white objects near the mouth of the Zeledayeva River. Believing them to be quartz, he brought the boat to shore. The objects turned out to be scraps of paper, notebooks, documents, and a battered Norwegian flag. It was Amundsen's missing mail. It and a multitude of other supplies were abandoned here by Tessem and Knutsen just 90 kilometers from their destination of Tixen. Evidently, the Norwegians made it this far, but some catastrophe occurred to cause the men to abandon the mail. 60 kilometers from Dixon, on the banks of the Ubenaya River, Ervensev found dilapidated huts and 2 pairs of skis. No Norwegian would ever abandon their skis unless there was no other option, further cementing the fact that something changed their situation drastically. Additionally, 2 pairs of skis were found, making it likely that both Tessem and Knutsen were alive at this point. On 14 August, Ervensev found himself in the weather station on Dixon. They had to stay at Dixon for at least a year, as they had missed their steamer, so Begichev and others were sent to the mainland to hunt reindeer for food. A few hours later, they returned with staggering information. On the mainland, a skeleton, one of the missing Norwegians. The skeleton lay just 3 kilometers away, still within sight of the weather station. The skeleton was situated on a high shore about 4 meters from the water. The left leg was straight, but the right leg was bent under, and his arms were spread out beside him. This limb position implied a sudden and violent death, likely after slipping on the rocks. By his waist was a pocket watch, with the engraving Ziegler Polar Expedition to Peter L. Tessem, ship's carpenter. Further establishing the narrative that the skeleton is Tessem's, his wedding ring was also found on him. Furthermore, in 1982, photographs of the 2 men and the skeleton were analyzed in the plastic reconstruction laboratory. They suggested that based on the shape and size of the skull, it's extremely unlikely that it was Knutsen's, but it might possibly belong to Tessem. So, Tessem and Knutsen left Mistchaljusken in September 1919 with provisions for 2 weeks. It took them more than a month to reach Misfjorda on November 10, 1919, fairly slow progress on very slim rations. It can be assumed that the abandoned sledge and the fire at Permetny was not theirs. Then some serious disaster occurred near the Zeledayeva River where the 2 men abandoned the mail. 30 kilometers farther west by the Ubenaya River, both pairs of skis were discarded for reasons unknown. At some point between the 2 skis and Dixon, Knutsen disappeared. Then, just 3 kilometers from Dixon, Tessem died. This mystery is still unsolved, but this is what I think happened. Tessem and Knutsen traveled to Misfjorda in a fatigued condition, as they had not brought many rations. Then, finding that much of the rations at the cache were spoiled by the sea, they were only able to take 20 days of provisions for the final stretch, weakening their progress. Around the Zeledayeva River, their situation radically changed. I believe that the sledge dogs somehow got lost, maybe succumbing to the conditions, or they ran away chasing a reindeer or polar bear. Either way, Tessem and Knutsen were left with no dogs or sledge, and still a 100-kilometer journey that they would now have to make on foot. The loss of their sledge is why they abandoned the mail at the mouth of the Zeledayeva to aid their tiring journey. When they arrive at the Ubenaya River, both men are still alive, as they abandoned 2 separate pairs of skis. The reason for the desertion of the skis can be attributed to strong winds or a sudden thawing that left large stretches of the tundra snow-free, making skiing impossible. It is likely that on their journey they crossed Polynia Bay, as it was covered with a layer of ice. In Dixon, the locals have a lot of respect for this bay, because it is very likely to break through the ice and drown. On their journey across the bay, Knutsen fell in and drowned. Tessem likely fell in as well, but survived and made it to the nearest land. Already incredibly weakened from starvation and now freezing after falling into the water, Tessem still needed to complete the last 3 miles to Dixon. After he made it to the shore opposite of Polynia Bay, he likely saw the distant lights of the weather station on Dixon. His excitement was short-lived as he then slipped on the icy rocks and was knocked unconscious. There, just 3 miles from his destination, he succumbed to exposure. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the ill-fated journey of Tessem and Knutsen is that they completed 99.7% of the trek, but within lights of the Dixon weather station, the place they had been pursuing for multiple months, they fell victim to the cold Arctic. that's that. 2 Arctic explorers dead in northern Siberia. To be honest, it's a miracle that I even finished this short documentary at all with the deadline I was given. There are still many parts of the video that I would like changed or improved, but for now, this is good enough. I'd like to thank Sam Noginski for some research and translation help, and William Burr, who brought this Arctic unsolved mystery to the English-speaking world. Without him, I would never have found the topic. It really is a shame how the age of Arctic exploration is often overlooked. As I was researching this topic, I found countless of other stories and even more mysteries of the Arctic, all very exciting, and all were unknown to me before. Anyway, thanks for watching.